Dave Wright, welcome along the show, mate. Good to see you again.
Gareth, thanks so much for having me on. Good to see you too.
Yeah, we go back a few years, 2019, when I first moved to Melbourne. I had a bit of time on my hands before I started in my role with Melbourne Victory and caught up with yourself for a coffee in South Melbourne. And you were working as an academy coach for the club then. I wanted to tease as much information out of you as possible. Fellow Kiwi, living in Melbourne, working in the club and in the football industry. And yeah, it was. You obviously left a reasonably good impression because 5 and a bit years later, I'm still here. So I appreciate the time then, and I appreciate your time today coming on the show.
No, all good. It was certainly, good to connect. And I know we only crossed paths for a short period of time before I left the club, but great to see you've done well over there. And I certainly enjoyed my time being a part of the club when I was living in Melbourne for sure.
So you're back in Auckland, New Zealand. You've got a couple of different roles, which we'll dig into shortly. But I get to hear your voice, probably 3, 4 times a year on Craig Harrison's podcast show, where you guys are the Curious Mind duo. I love listening to these episodes because you're both deep thinkers about sport, about movement, about play, about joy, about coaching, about education, about youth, and really rich speakers as well. So you're going to put me to a little bit of shame on this podcast, mate. But yeah, those are great episodes for those who hadn't listened into the Athlete Development Show and specifically the Curious Mind with Dave Wright. Do so. But yeah, tell us about how that started about, mate. That's reasonably recent, right?
Yeah, look, I've been home in New Zealand for 4.5 years now, and I was away for 12 years prior to that. So it's been pretty interesting. And obviously we've all survived and got through the COVID period, which was pretty crazy for most people. So yeah, got to know Craig and I'd actually been on his podcast when I was still living in Melbourne. So it was the first time we'd kind of connected and then subsequently hosted him through player development projects. So yeah, we just decided having, I guess, got to spend a bit of time face to face and talking player development and all of the challenges in the sports system in New Zealand that it might be cool just to get together every few months and do something regular. So I rate Craig. I think he's a great operator and a great thinker, as you said. And it's nice to get in a room with somebody who can ask really good questions. And we just tend to go down the rabbit hole and see where the conversation leads. So it's usually about 5 minutes of planning. And I'm glad the episodes are coming out the other side in a pretty decent fashion because we've had some nice feedback on it.
No, they certainly have, and looking forward to the next one. It's been a while. I know you've been a busy man. You've been off in Fiji and your various hats that you wear from day to day. So, yeah, looking forward to the next one. I get to tune in on. Hey, we have you on today predominantly to speak around coaching. The time that you spent in the UK, predominantly in the academy system, but you've had a very vast range of coaching different ages and stages of kids. So looking forward to getting into that. But from a playing perspective, pretty modest playing career and got into coaching very early. So just want to maybe just touch on that briefly. Like why the shift into coaching so young? And yeah, why not continue down the playing career?
Yeah, look, I played at a reasonable level locally, but I pretty quickly worked out I was never going to be a professional. And the other thing in my childhood is that I reflect on just loving every sport. I still love football and football's the sport and the industry that I work in, but I do love a lot of other sports. I've always been an absolute rugby league tragic. Like I love rugby league. I think it's a great game to watch. I've played cricket and golf most of my life. And I just love sport. So yeah, I guess I felt that I wasn't necessarily ever pursuing becoming a professional player. I never really had that ambition to be a pro, but fell into coaching just when I started studying. And I'd always wanted to be in sport, and I'd gone down the path of starting a business degree, which quite quickly I pivoted towards a sort of media and sports management degree. Just because I realized I didn't really love doing what I was doing at uni, and the chance to coach at my old school came up and got asked to go in there and do a bit, and it was a chance to make a few bucks while I was in my first year or so of university. And very quickly, I learned that I just loved inspiring kids primarily and leading. And I'd always been, I guess, a leader in sport. I'd captained the first 11 cricket team, and I'd sort of been around captaincy roles with school football, for example. But yeah, got to go in there and coach, and I just fell in love with it. And on the playing side, I kept playing for a while during that period into probably my mid-20s, stop start. I played a lot of futsal when I was living in Sydney, for example. But yeah, I just sort of fell out of love with it. I just really didn't enjoy the club culture that I found myself in at different clubs. Frankly, as I got more knowledgeable in the coaching space, I found it difficult to be coached by coaches who were probably well-meaning volunteers. And I started to learn a little bit about what good coaching looked like from mentors like Tony Reddings and John Herdman and Ricky Herbert, who were in the New Zealand system at the time, driving coach education. So yeah, very quickly decided that I loved coaching more than playing, and that's kind of how that ended.
I can kind of relate a little bit. I probably played a little bit longer than then. I think I stopped at 31, but
Yeah.
I was coaching and playing simultaneously as well. And looking back now, whilst it was allowing me to do both and keep my foot in it both, it was limiting both in the same idea. I can think back to a couple of mates that I was teammates with, and I was trying to coach on the field whilst I was playing because had the coaching bug, I was developing it, and they used to get really shitty with me, like just be a player. Don't try and be the assistant coach or the reserve team coach right now. Like you need to play. And then equally so, when a little bit older, I was further down my coaching journey. I'm looking at the coach who's delivering the session. I'm like, this is not how I would do it, or this is terrible. I must have been difficult to coach with, to be coach. So yeah, some real challenges with that, and cutting that umbilical cord and committing to one. I think it was kind of my feedback to my younger self, if I could do it again. So you got yourself over to Australia. Fairly, you had some experiences in New Zealand. You got yourself to Australia. What is the main, I guess, cultural or social or mentality? What's the differences between coaching, let's say, football in New Zealand, which is the biggest city in New Zealand, to coaching now in New South Wales and Sydney?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting because I'd been coaching, probably by the time I moved to Sydney, I'd been coaching 6 or 7 years, and the highest level was National Women's League here in Auckland. And I had what was effectively my B license. It was called the old National Academy license back in the day. So it was your level 3 in New Zealand football qualifications, and was feeling really confident about that. And just ended up moving to Sydney more because my brother was already there, and my best mate and I decided we wanted to move to Sydney and live in Sydney and get out of Auckland. And my brother and I had a business there. We started in Sydney in hospitality, which was unbelievable learning. And subsequent to that, I wanted to continue coaching. So I got involved pretty quickly with Football New South Wales state programs, and then ended up at a club in the eastern suburbs called Maccabi, which was a really good experience. And the difference, I think, primarily between the two is I think the win-at-all-cost culture in Australia is a bit more prevalent. So I think winning is talked about more openly. I think there's probably a little bit more intensity with some of the games, and that's not necessarily a good thing, but I do admire the sort of tenacity and competitiveness of Australian sport. I've always loved that kind of, at least at the performance level, the ruthless nature of their elite teams in whatever sport. And of course, over the years, you can look at cricket as a good example, where perhaps they've pushed the envelope too far at times. But at the same time, I do love that sort of determination and winning mentality that comes with Australian sport. And I think the other thing with Aussie kids, when you're working with youth players or you're working with players who are transitioning towards performance, there's probably more confidence. I think the nature of the New Zealand psyche or New Zealand culture, where often people talk about things like tall poppy syndrome or the humble Kiwi, I think at times that can be a really competitive advantage when we look at analogies like sweep the sheds that the All Blacks are famous for, and that sort of, I guess that humility that comes with success. But I know that can also hold kids back from being confident and comfortable and saying, hey, this is what I'm really good at and I want to get better at. And that confidence thing, I think, is a difference in mentality perhaps between Australia and New Zealand. So that's probably the big observation.
You mentioned Hospo learnings. Keen to find out a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, hospitality was a lot of fun. So we had a cafe business in Sydney called Two Black Sheep, which we owned it for 5 years. And alongside that, we ended up with a pop-up project as well called Park Bench, which was great fun. So I think at the peak of our trading, we probably had somewhere between 14 and 18 staff across both sites. And so the big learnings were, first of all, employing and managing people. There's a lot of transfer between hiring staff, developing staff, feeding back to staff around, their own development, or perhaps where performance isn't quite at the level, or where you've got to make difficult decisions to let people go. We had processes around that, and we had some challenges there. Similarly, it's also hugely customer facing. So every day you've got to get up, whatever mood, week, or sort of time you're having in your own life, and you've got to get up and face up to a wave of customers in the morning and put on a face and host and make people feel welcome. And the definition of hospitality is to make people feel welcome. Often I think that can sometimes be lost in contemporary hospitality businesses. But the experience there around dealing with, a high foot traffic, high volume business where we had a huge community and brand around in the city of Sydney, and every day you're hearing the life stories of people or the issues going on. It's kind of the old hairdresser, barber, barman mentality where you end up getting to know your customers. So just a huge amount of connection with people. So whether it was behind the counter or on the other side of the counter, just connection was a big one. And community, again, was a key part of that business and its success. So big learnings that transferred into coaching.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. When I had came back from the US, I would have been, say, 24, 25. My father had a cafe restaurant. So I'd go and work in there whilst I was figuring out what I was going to do with my life. And I started off in the kitchen. I was on dishes and kind of, I've been thinking about this a lot recently because not my role around the house here is to do the dishes and tidy up stuff, but I like things clean and tidy and nice and neat and put away. And I think maybe my couple of years spent kind of in the cafe industry was, they had to be, there's a process and they had to be in and out, and it was couldn't just stack up because we'd run out of plates. So kind of planning and forward thinking of, okay, this has to happen now, and then this is the stage. And that would really help shape a lot of my, I guess, planning capabilities. I moved out to the floor, and whilst I didn't make amazing coffees, I was having to wait tables and take orders, and being that outward facing customer person. And the cafe lunch crowd is, very different to the dinner crowd. And fortunately or unfortunately, depends which way you look at it, we had a secret shopper come in and write a review in the paper, and I happened to serve this guy, and I read the report back, and it was reasonably flattering for the business, but he addressed me as the spiky-haired creature came to grief, and I had a bit of a spiky mohawk back then, and kind of got a conversation about what this meant, and it kind of made me more conscious that you don't know who you're talking to. It's a bit like coaching or playing. You don't know who's watching. The interaction you have, it could be with a secret shopper, it could be with somebody it could be with somebody that's going to speak highly or poorly of you in the future. Every impression can make or break or help or hinder you along the way. So
100%.
Yeah,
you only get one chance in Hospo to make a first impression, right? So if the food's bad, the coffee's bad, the service is bad, it's unlikely people are going to come back. And beyond that, the systems and processes you have to have in place to be consistent in what you deliver, whether that's service or product, are essential. And I think the other thing with hospitality is it teaches people hard work. You're on your feet all day. You're doing long shifts. We had days where we had both shops open, where we'd have one shop open for sort of 9-10 hours and the other one would be open for another 6 hours. So we'd sort of end up, running two businesses from 6 till 10 or 11 at night. And you learn how to work hard. And that sort of, I think, was really valuable in terms of that transition up to the UK, because you're prepared to graft and you're prepared to do the work. So I always think, like I want my boys one day to have the experience of working in hospitality, as long as AI hasn't sort of decimated the industry. But I think the experience of dealing with people and working hard is critical.
No, I totally agree. We come back to kind of the psyche around the Australians. You spoke about that high level of self-confidence, the direction and committed and going here. You then not too long after moved to the UK, which we'll spend a bit of time digging into. But you were there 6 years working different roles with Brentford and Fulham predominantly. But just before we dig into those football environments specifically, what's the difference between the Aussie mentality and athlete to the UK or the British mentality?
Yeah, look, I think the caveat on my answer would be that it depends where you work, right? But I think what I was very lucky to see in London was you've got 13 pro clubs within the M25. So that's essentially the ring road motorway that goes around London. So it's a very condensed, obviously huge population, a lot of professional clubs, a lot of competitions for talent. So what that generates, and it can be a positive and a negative, is a huge amount of competition. And when you see kids who, let's say, come from a socio-cultural background where maybe their family's from North Africa, they're living in a council estate in southeast London, and they very quickly work out that football might be the only pathway out of poverty for their family. And I've seen kids at 9, 10, 11 who clearly have had this realization. They get themselves into the system, they might have potential, and you contrast that with the relatively comfortable life, and I say that with all due respect, knowing that there's every end of the spectrum in New Zealand and Australia, but when you look at the world and where some people live and how they live, and you contrast that with the general Australian, New Zealand lifestyle, there's parts of the UK that can be really tough, and London certainly can be really tough. It can be a tough place to grow up if you don't have any wealth or any, or your family's just working to get by. So that determination and desire, I've seen it in kids where I can think of one boy who, when I was coaching sort of under 12s at Fulham for a season there, I can still remember hearing his lungs and hearing him breathe. We were playing away at Arsenal and we had a couple of injuries in the game, and he ended up having to play the full 80 minutes because we played in 4 20-minute quarters in the academy system. Played the full 80, and the boys were competing, and this kid just doesn't stop. He just wouldn't stop. He just never stopped running for his mates and for his team. And for me, he was an example of one of these kids who came from a tough background, and he's still at the club in the under 23s, and he's still doing really well. And I look at that desire and determination, and when I hear, and again, I say this respectfully, but I'm becoming more and more transparent and honest in my views, when I hear a parent or a player come to me and say, oh, I fancy having a crack at it in England, you've got to prepare them for the reality. So yes, love the ambition. Yes, how do we get you through the system to potentially go from, an A-League environment to a European environment or an American environment, wherever they end up. But be prepared for the brutality that you are going to be up against someone who is not going to allow you to rip the shirt off their back. So the big contrast here was that level of desire, the speed of the game, the competition when kids are in a professional context so young. It's just, a real eye-opener. And I still remember standing on the grass the very first session I went into Brentford to observe and then do a job interview, and seeing the speed of the players, the athleticism, the competitiveness of the session. It was like nothing I'd seen down under. So I very quickly had to learn how to deal with players working at that level.
So how do we as coaches, we as program leads, we as parents, we as athletes, how can we best prepare without knowing, without seeing it, without feeling it ourselves previously? So people like yourself, purpose of this podcast, I guess, is to try and extract the learnings of those who have gone before us, right? So, just in your own words, how can we prepare for that eventuality in order to kind of give ourselves the best chance to sort of stay and let it stick rather than kind of get bounced around and not for us?
I think, look, we're seeing more and more Kiwi and Australian players, again, through the A-League's a great example, where it is a development league for European clubs to look at and go, and Libby Kakachi is a great example from New Zealand, right? He's in the Serie A now and transitioned from the Phoenix to Europe, and he's doing well. So I think the big thing for me is, if I was offering practical advice, it's about how do you build attributes like resilience and initiative into the athlete or into the child. And so I look at that from a parenting perspective, and I think, well, really important to ensure that we're not over-servicing our kids as parents. And in program design, and I can sort of refer to the HPAD work, I know we'll talk about a little bit later, around the importance of not over-servicing athletes. And I think when you go into these environments where you go to a Tottenham Hotspur, a Southampton or a Chelsea, and they're incredible facilities, you look at that and you go, well, there's a good chance here that a 12-year-old might start feeling a little entitled or a little comfortable because of the scale and quality of what they're getting. And the argument could be said that actually a lot of those kids are getting too much too soon, if you're really critical of the system. So I think finding a balance where you go, well, how do we, in our program, design for that psychological space around resilience, confidence, and commitment. And then over the longer term, well, the performance behaviors of young athletes are generally going to be the best indicators of whether they're going to have the attributes to successfully transition into high performance, which at times can be a really brutal world, whatever the sport. So that would be the big one, is prepare for the realities of how difficult transition as an athlete can be, and how difficult it could be if you're a Kiwi or Australian kid, for example, who then suddenly finds themselves overseas and you don't necessarily have that direct support network around. Now, a good example is my great mate who's still over in the USA, Cameron Knowles. Knowlesy's been there for 22 years. Went over to college, and recently I had him on a Zoom call with some of my young players who are under 18s, and some of them looking to go to university. And he said his bit of advice to the boys was, look, I get loads of emails and requests to sort of help out, and I'll always help Kiwi kids, but my advice is do it yourself. Don't get your parents to start writing to coaches. Don't get your parents to start doing this and that for you. Do it yourself. Take the initiative as a 17, 18-year-old, write the email, do your football CV, do your clips. So again, initiative and resilience, like be prepared for a challenging time and be prepared for critical and honest feedback at times that you might not like, because it's hard.
What about preparing yourself as a coach? So you're a Kiwi or Aussie kid.
Yep.
They've gone to the UK to look in the academy system as the coach now. So how did that come about? Is it something you just landed in the UK and you turned up at the door and you put your CV in, or you had an in initially, which is quite often the way in the sport industry? How did that move eventuate for you?
Well, it's one of the things I'm most proud of. I had no in. And we sold the business at the start of 2013, so we were in the process of selling it. It was the end of 2012, I'd gone up to the UK for 5 weeks and then back via the States to see the MLS Combine and a couple of mates who were down in Florida. And I decided that as we were selling the business, I had a British passport, my family's all English, and that if we sell the business, I'm going to go on a one-way ticket, and I need to know and I need to prove to myself, first of all, that I can get the UEFA B license. That was the first goal. And I want to give myself every chance to crack it in professional football. I was in a position where I was able to travel. I was in a position where I was able to do that at that stage and age in my life. And I'd gone up to do this course called the FA International License, which was 2 weeks at St. George's Park just as it opened. It was an amazing experience with, I think we had 33 coaches from about 25 countries from all around the world who'd signed up for this course, which was a hybrid of the FA Level 2 and the UEFA B content. And basically they said at the start of the course, if you get the advanced award on this course, you can then be fast-tracked straight onto a B license. So for me, I had to get that advanced award. So luckily or fortunately, I put the work in and had a great 2 weeks, got the advanced award, flew back to Sydney, we sold the business, and I basically decided, right, I'm going to leave and head to the UK on a one-way ticket. So I flew up there in May of that year and proceeded to email every single club, call around, knock on doors. At one point, I went up and met with Huddersfield Town. I drove all the way to Yorkshire to meet with them, and I was just prepared to get into any club. And so my level of desire was huge in terms of I'm here for one reason only, and that's to try and crack it. And luckily, I was living initially in West London, and I ended up getting a response from Stuart English, who was head of coaching at Brentford. So at that point, I had 10 years experience, and obviously my qualifications went through the FA, but he recognised something, I think, different in me. I was perhaps a few years older than some of the academy staff as well. And yeah, at that point, they were prepared to give me 3 months over the preseason to come in. I had to work for free. And that led to a part-time opportunity with the club the following season. At that stage, they were League One. And very quickly, I found myself in an environment where I probably learned more in the first year or two in the UK than I'd learned in the previous 10. And to go back to your question, yeah, I had the funny accent. I was the Kiwi coach who probably had an Aussie twang at that stage, and went up there, and I probably had a good year or so of genuine imposter syndrome, where I thought, how do I affect these players? And I was lucky at Brentford, where generally you'd get opportunities to coach across all the age groups. So I did work in the foundation phase, the youth development phase. Even at one point, the club ran some trials for under 21s, and I'd go in and observe under 21 sessions during the day with John D'Souza, who's now at the Premier League. He was the 21s coach, great coach. Watch him deliver. So, some really good coaches, and I had to get over that imposter syndrome. But the environment was immensely demanding. It was hard. The academy director was intense and demanding. But the diversity that we had in terms of the coaching group, and some of those coaches who genuinely made me feel welcome, and they would feed back, and we'd sit around after Tuesday night sessions, for example, and reflect on how everyone went. After games, we'd debrief on every single player across every single age group. And there's so much reflection I sort of fell into a rhythm with it and had, almost 3 seasons, almost three full seasons at Brentford. And geez, I just look back on that time as intense and rapid in terms of my development and understanding of what developing a player looks like.
A couple of threads I want to tie together. So recent guest, Karesh Monsef, the value
Mhm.
of formalised coach education. He said you need to have this formal coach education piece, qualification before I can even be considered. So the value of working through your formalised coach education. Ollie Harder spoke about the leap of faith. So leaving, I think he was in Canada. I'm going to get myself to the UK. I'm going to make it work. However that's going to happen, and I'm going to keep grafting until I'm knocking every door until a door opens. And Marco Rojas, as well as Archie Thompson, spoke about what's the worst that can happen. I just come back to
That's
live
right.
into Melbourne or to Sydney or back to New Zealand, and life's actually not that bad. So yeah, take those sort of risks and those chances. But there's an element of, you spoke about hard work in terms of formalized stuff, in terms of grafting, in terms of putting
Mm,
yourself out there, and then you'll get an opportunity. And it's about how you deal with that opportunity. So you spoke about working for free. Well, that's the reality. Quite
mm,
often in high performance sport environments is you might get a chance. We're not necessarily going to pay you straight away. We need to see your qualities in action and are you the right fit. But are you prepared to go and give your time for free? Don't expect
mm,
given things right away. And then just be a sponge and put yourself out there. And you spoke about the intensity of the environment. Lots of reflection as a group, which I love to hear, but maybe a
mm.
lot of self-reflection as well. If we pull back the curtain a little bit now, just to give, I guess, athletes listening in, parents of these athletes, and even coaches, like, how would you take this where you wish, right? How would you describe to me let's say, the under 16 environment at Fulham or Brentford? For a
Mhm.
pure academy system, quality athletes, maybe near the national under 17 team, maybe getting paid a little bit on that track to the Premier League. That's the dream. We're not far
Yep.
away. I kind of see it. It's in the horizon, but I'm on that journey. I'm close. What is pull back the curtain to the environment? What does it look like? Firstly, as an athlete, as a coach, um, and then maybe if you can draw any connections to, this is something that I really learned from there that I think really needs to be listened and heard to for people on this journey.
Yeah, so I think some good points there, and I think that what's the worst that can happen? I think you always encourage people to take risks, right? So that's an important one to take away from that. Is my worst case was, well, the worst case scenario is I go back and have to make coffee again to make up for the money I've just spent on a year or two of being in the UK, and that keeping that in the back of your mind, that having a punt and taking a risk, whether it's as a player or a coach, I think I'd always encourage, particularly coaches, to get abroad, even if it's just going from New Zealand to Australia to see the level and the difference, as you've experienced. And I think that's an important one. So to go back to your point around, a little bit of behind the scenes. So first of all, you got to zoom out and understand where the system's been and where it is now in terms of the UK academy system. So I think it's important to frame up how it works. So in around, I think, 2011, 2012, the EPPP, the Elite Player Performance Plan, was introduced. Initially, that was audited by an independent company called Double Pass. So Double Pass would come into clubs all around Europe and at that point, clubs in the Premier League. And it's important to say the Premier League academy system doesn't just mean the 20 teams in the Premier League. It means all the teams in the system because they're all ranked differently. So you could be a Premier League team, but you might have a Category 2 or Category 3 academy, for example. Category 1 is the highest ranking. So Brentford was a Category 2 program. The ranking system at the time and is now fully audited and controlled by the Premier League itself, as opposed to having Double Pass come in. The ranking is generally tied to the quality of coaches, the quality of facilities, the quality of games program, and the higher you get in your ranking, the more you can access a better games program. So your big clubs play your big clubs. So the system has been now, I guess, established for about 12 years. And I arrived probably a year or two after it had started, where clubs were really working hard to try and attain that Category 1 status. I remember sitting in the back of Stu's car I didn't have a car for the first couple of years in London. So I was often either riding my bike or getting a lift. And I said to Stu, when do you think, this is Stuart English, who's now up at Sunderland, who was at Brentford. And I said, when do you think England will win a World Cup based on what's happening with the system? And he and I talked about it, and I remember sort of saying, he said, 10 years is probably realistic now. In the last major finals, we've seen the English team get there and almost get there in terms of success. And the quality of player coming through is important. So within that system now, you've got these category ranked clubs who are Cat 1s can still play against Cat 2 and Cat 3s, where you've got a minimum standard of coaching. So the minimum standard is, let's say, UEFA B license to get into an academy job. Over time, that will continue to increase. You'll see a lot of jobs now where the minimum you've got to have is an A license and a FA Advanced Youth Award, which is the A license of youth coaching. So the standard of coaching has progressively over that 10 years got higher and higher. You've got depth in terms of knowledge and quality across staff. So you've got multidisciplinary teams where you've got S&C coaches, you've got psychologists, you might have multi-sport components to your program. You've obviously got football coaches. You'll have an education department. A lot of clubs will have a tie to a school, so that Fulham, for example, the players could go to school over the back fence if they were part of the full-time program, and then come in for day release sessions because they literally were just going through the fence to the school behind the training ground. And then, of course, you've got key components like safeguarding, which are critical. You'll often hear some really challenging and difficult stories from players who are perhaps a bit older now who might have been in the system 20, 25 years ago. I think the EPPP system has been superb in terms of regulating that and ensuring welfare and well-being. And whilst the system certainly has its flaws in my mind around the age of selection and age of entry being very, very young, and the race to the bottom around talent is not a good thing. I've often had this debate with colleagues in the past where you go, well, the young boy who comes from nothing or the young girl who comes from nothing and then suddenly finds himself in this academy world where they're seeing opportunities that they would have never otherwise seen in their life. That might be to go to a tournament out in Germany or France or down to Portugal or wherever, travel, go on a plane for the first time in their life, be exposed to structure and discipline and good programming. So the upside can still be there even if a player doesn't make it as such. Beyond that, you're then going to have a volume of contacts per week. The foundation phase players will train 3 times and play on the weekends. You get variety of games programs. The Premier League put on festivals, player-led, five-a-side, futsal, all sorts of different experiences. So that over the course of that sort of 10 to 11-month season, players are being exposed to a huge amount of different challenges, whether that's a Category 3 club playing against a Cat 1, and that's going to be a really hard day for those kids from the Cat 3 club, or whether it's a Cat 1 playing the 3, and the expectation is, right, we're going to have a really dominant day today. So it's sort of a green light game where we expect to win. The programming and the depth and the quality of people in the system is high. But as I say, it's not perfect. There's lots of flaws in the UK system. And more so that the level is genuinely high. And I count myself very lucky to have seen what a really good 10, 12, 14, 16, 18-year-old footballer looks like. And I think that's something that I, again, try to be quite transparent with now that I'm back here in New Zealand, is understanding what a genuinely high-quality player looks like in those ages.
The EPPP, right? So I look back to club licensing here in Australia, back in New Zealand. Now, I know there's been a bit of pushback from clubs, from member federations around this, and some, I'm talking about both New Zealand and Australia here, or New Zealand and Victoria. Some do it really well. Some have kind of gone, well, it's too hard over here, it doesn't quite work in our region, so we're going to water it down. But the reality there with EPPP is it's going to take some time, and that rising tide eventually lifts all boats, right?
Yep.
The quality of the outcome of the top end and all the stages between will eventually improve. The quality, the minimum standard of coaches has to improve to follow that as well, so that sort of tide lifts also. So, yeah, there's been, I know, some really key impactors in New Zealand and Australia who really try to push the club licensing piece with some real resistance. So, yeah, my advice for people listening is go with it. Keep pushing your bar higher, because ultimately it's the trees that we plant now that we'd never see. That's where the growth happens and the success in the future.
Yeah, and I'd agree with that. And I think that the challenge, is largely the amateur nature of the system, and I guess the investment the clubs might have to make, or the investment they have to make in people. And I do understand that, but I agree with you. You've got to, over time, you've got to invest in people. You've got to invest in capability. You've got to invest in good programming. And the fruits of that labor will come, but you've got to understand it's a 10-year project. This is cycles of young kids entering a system at maybe 8 or 9 years old in a skill centre environment, for example, in New Zealand, into a talent development program environment. You're not really going to see the fruits of that until 8 to 10 years later when they're 16 or 18 years old. So it is a patience game, and that can be a tough one. But yeah, over time, if you invest in quality development of people and programming, then you will see benefits for sure.
Just circling back to you said you now know what the capabilities of a really high performing 17-year-old athlete is, right? So firstly, give me the environment. How often are they training? How many games are they playing? You spoke a little bit about the diversity of the games piece, which I love as well, and that's
Yep.
I've been thinking about trying to drip feed into the environments that I have impact over here. But yeah, give me a little bit of taste of the environment. I'm a super talented 17-year-old in that system playing for a Cat 1 or Cat 2 club. And then what does the athlete look like? What can you share as me as a coach listening at, like I can spot this in a player, or I'm a player now thinking, oh, okay, these are some behaviors or some qualities that I need to make sure are on display as often as I possibly can.
Yeah, so I think the most important thing, and again, I remember returning to Melbourne in 2017, or returning to Australia, moving to Melbourne and presenting at the Football Victoria Coaches Convention or coaching conference that was organised at the time around some of the insights on this. And the first thing is identifying a super strength. I think as a researcher or I guess an expert psychologist called Professor Stephen Rollnick, and if people haven't heard of Stephen Rollnick's work, he's a expert in motivational interviewing. He pioneered that sort of method of interview, and he's transitioned a bit into sport in the last 5 or 7 years. He talks about coaches being deficit detectives. It's real easy to look at kids or players and go, well, they're not very good at that. But actually looking at what is a player's attribute and their super strength. And this ties back to what I was saying earlier around kids being confident enough to speak up. When you have a one-to-one, what are you best at? When you're on the football pitch, what is it that you're best at? Now, that could be technical, it could be psychological, but being very clear on we're identifying talent because of what they're good at. So let's say we've got a really athletic young player who's showing good 1v1 ability, right? Naturally, people might watch that if they're not coaches or they're looking at the team performance and they're saying, well, that player's selfish. That player doesn't pass the ball enough. It's highly likely if that player's in an academy system, the coaches have, as part of that player's individual development plan, have said, well, actually today we just want you to dribble at players and run with the ball. That's your attribute. Go and do what you're best at. Now, the minimum standards off the ball will likely be, well, you've got to work hard and you've got to show desire, and that's expected. But on the ball, we want you to show, excite the crowd. Show us what you can do. So you are looking at players for what they're best at. When I think about my discussions when I was in the UK with people who worked in recruitment or scouts, generally the first thing they'd look for with a player, and I remember getting this answer from 3 or 4 different people, might be how players receive the ball. So can they deal with the football? Just on a technical level, right? And then beyond that, you've got things around performance behaviors, which I alluded to earlier. So do they turn up and do extras? Do they have the right attitude at training? The word coachability is one I don't necessarily love. I think it's super subjective. And I think, there's a lot of kids that are hard to coach that can be unbelievable talents. So, and I can think of literally dozens of kids that were difficult to coach in the UK, but are still in the system because they've got that point of difference. They might have that unbelievable confidence. They might have the audacity to try things in a game that nobody else would. Scoops, flicks, tricks, 1v1 skills, or they want to emulate Neymar or something like that. And a lot of times, I think in amateur environments, that can be coached out of a player because it negatively impacts the team performance, which obviously means we might lose the game. So again, an important thing to mention is that there aren't league tables in academy football. Fulham and Chelsea aren't going to play each other for 3 points in the under 14s. This is about, do we have the best players in our club? And if we don't, we might look at recruiting players from another club. But do you have the best players? So at Brentford, for example, the metrics of success on game day there'd be 3 things. So did we dominate possession because we want to be a possession football team? Did we have the best player on the pitch individually? So have we recruited the right players? And is the opposition got someone that maybe we should be looking at for our program? And then the third one would be, well, what was the score? Now, if we got 2 out of 3 of those things, that would be seen as a win. So you might lose the game, but you might dominate the ball and you might have the best player on the pitch. So that would be deemed a successful day out. So, yes, there's cup competitions for players who are older. So once you get into that sort of FA Youth Cup age, the scholarship age, there's under 16 and under 15 tournaments that are competitive. But really, there's no league tables. And this is the thing that frustrates me, and probably the New Zealand and Australian context, is that we end up with a lot of people stressing about results in youth football when actually we should be looking at performance and the indicators of performance if we're working with young players. So yeah, there's a lot of, it's a melting pot, because I can think of players again now who are currently around the first team at Fulham, who I coached, a number of years ago, young players who might have been middle of the group. They weren't necessarily the best players at 12, 13. They might have been a quieter kid, but they might have had unbelievable attributes in other ways, and they have managed to, some might say, survive the system because it is brutal, but they've managed to navigate it because perhaps they're really good learners, or they're really open to critical feedback, or they are the ones that are doing extras, or they're really consistent in their football actions, whether that's just simply passing the ball with quality and or taking risks with their passing and playing really effective, dangerous split passes. So we've got to look at what the players are capable of, look at their strengths, and try and build on those strengths. And it's not to say we don't tidy up the areas around it, but we're not going to judge a 9 or 11-year-old on their physical capabilities before they've hit puberty and gone through the maturation process. So we've got to identify attributes and try and support kids get better at what they're best at.
Yeah, I like that criteria. It's got my brain thinking to when I was working with the 14s and then the 15s here at Melbourne Victory in my earlier days. We had 5 benchmark criteria. For the end of every game, we went through and go, well, did we do these 5 things? And we needed to get at least 3 of them for that day to be deemed a success, right? So in no particular order, did we win the match? So yes, no. Did we draw? Draw would be like a neutral response. So again, obviously kids wanting to win is something we were trying to foster, but it wasn't the only criteria in our benchmark. Did you learn something about yourself, about the game, about your teammates, whatever? So everybody in the squad had to sort of respond, yes, hand up if you did, if not. So if over 50% put the hand up, then that was a tick for the collective, because not everybody's going to learn something different every single opportunity, but did the majority? Did the majority experience something new? So was it a new shape, a new style? Did you play counter-attack that you hadn't done before? Did you play in a different position that you hadn't really experienced? Did you play in torrential rain? Did you play against the team a year above that were dominant? Did you play against a team that played a block that you never really experienced before? So again, what new set of experiences did this 90-minute component provide? Did you feel joy or fun? Did you enjoy yourself today? And were we able to kind of implement the theme for the week? So whatever our theme was, like, were we not so much successful at executing that, but did we feel that we could see enough of what we had learned through the training week and applied in the test, which was the match? So that was sort of our criteria. And again, that wasn't club driven. That was me driven. I'm working with the youngest 2 age groups of the whole pathway. The furthest you can get away from the first team within that system as possible. So therefore, it should be the furthest away from results matters.
Yes,
that was my feeling and belief around youth and junior development. It wasn't driven by somebody, but yeah, it's nice to hear that there's another set of criteria other than just the result.
Yeah, and look, I think to build on that, one of my frustrations or challenges, perhaps, and again, I think the system is different in that if you're an academy player in the UK, you're not paying a penny to be part of that. You are recruited and you get the experience, whereas we have pay-to-play models in Australia and New Zealand, which absolutely parents are now literally an invested stakeholder in that process, and they expect a product to be delivered in the form of a good program or good coaching. So they do absolutely have rights to ask questions. But the thing is, when I've encountered resistance to doing things like mixed age street football as part of the program, or playing players up and down an age group, then you're sitting there going, well, if it's good enough for the Premier League academy system and it's proven to be effective in terms of developing players based on individual need, then it should be good enough for us. And that could be things as simple as we're going to run a football festival. I remember being part of a player-led festival at Chelsea. We went down there and I can't remember how many teams were there on the day, but it would have been probably 6 or 8 different clubs all converging at Cobham, the training ground there. And the Premier League putting on a festival where you've got one timekeeper in the middle of the field, you've got a bunch of kids from different clubs all wearing their strips, and they're all technically competing with each other in the system. And they get given a playing card, and they go and do a player-led festival. They've got to go and find the team, find the players with the same card, and they do player-led. They referee themselves. There's one central timekeeper. There's no adult supervision. We're up in the grandstands having an afternoon off, thinking this is great. We don't even have to coach this afternoon. Essentially, so that players just get to go play. And the entire objective of the day was just a social one. Can we get young players developing social skills to go and meet and speak to other kids from other clubs? And then they get together, and an hour in, you've got 3 kids from 3 different clubs wearing Spurs, Chelsea and Fulham shirts, all celebrating in the corner because they've scored a goal. And immediately they've almost, because they're kids, they've forgotten, that they're not on the same team or part of the same club. So these kind of initiatives, I think the system is so structured around, we've got to have X number of games in the year, and we've got to have these competition structures, and we've got to have this level of coaching, and that's all great. But where's the participants sit at the center of this around the experience? And how do we provide a range of things? We go, we're going to do an inter-club futsal festival today. And it's not going to be, maybe some days there is a winner, and tournament football absolutely has value, and learning to win is a critical part of development. But it might be we're just focused on joy today. We're focused on social connection. We're focused on the kids taking initiative and learning some skills beyond the technical tactical, So we've got to look at adapting our systems to be more flexible so that we can, offer these kind of experiences as well as just leagues.
You mentioned systems, and I want to get to HPAD very, very shortly. Just want to hover one more question around the academy system, and I want to bring into this. So you spoke about like the identification of a player, the scouting of a player, maybe through trials or whatever, and then also the decision to release a player at any time. How much impact or connection with the parents now does the club or by proxy you, the coach, have in both the recruitment and also retention, but also the release? Like where do the parents come into this part?
Yeah, it's a great question. So generally the club, so for Fulham, for example, we would have reviews. So the players in the youth development phase would have a 6-week IDP, so individual development plan, and the players in the foundation phase would have a 12-week IDP. At the conclusion of that 12 weeks, there'd be a meeting with sometimes just the players in the older age groups, but mostly the player and the parent. So there'd generally be, from my memory, 2 to 3 player and parent meetings per year, where you'd have the player, the parent, and the 2 coaches in the room to sit down and have a one-to-one about how that player was tracking. If a player was, and the release side of things is really difficult, because when you're releasing kids really young, that's something that never sat well with me in terms of my own values and beliefs around development. When you're sitting across the room from a player who's under 12 and you're saying, hey, this is the end of the line for you, because players go from a 1-year rolling agreement through 9s to 12s, and then they might go into a 2-year agreement through 13s to 16s. So the clubs are always, that 12-13 can be quite a tough time, because the clubs are then going, we're going to commit to you for 2 years. And that's a roll of the dice. Again, when most of these kids are just hitting puberty or sort of going through a growth phase. So there's definitely contact and there's regular comms around how the player is tracking. So if the season finishes at the end of May and a player was below the line, they generally get a heads up in around December that, hey, look, at the moment, this is where you are and these are the things we need to see. I still look at that philosophically and go, how does that actually help the player? So the reasoning was, well, what we don't want it to do is come as a massive surprise in May if they get a release. We've got to sort of go, hey, look, at the moment, and I think that's fair on the player and fair on the family. And a lot of these kids do get picked up by other clubs if they get released, because once they're in the system, you can move around. But at the same time, my concern was always, was this putting a massive amount of doubt and fear into the player, which could inhibit performance? And so you can't necessarily win it either way, right? I think you do have a duty of care to be honest with the parents and the player around where they're tracking. So there was absolute transparency around that. And in terms of recruitment, I know when I last went back to the UK in 2022, I was lucky. I've got some friends who are at Crystal Palace and still friends at Fulham, and some down in Brighton. So I did a few study visits across the 3 clubs, and Fulham had gone a step further in introducing a trial, like a specific trial coach. So when a player was identified to come into the program and trial, they now had dedicated resource in the form of staff, where those players would be coming in for a 6-week block. So now we're looking at the player over a window of time. We're certainly not judging a player on 1 or 2 sessions, and nor did we do that in my time at the club. They'd always come in for a period of weeks, where they would get access to play games as well. So they'd be seen in the training and the games environment as a trialist. But they'd gone a step further to go, hey, we're going to have a dedicated person who's going to bring those trial players in, and they'll do a little bit of a training session with them before they then integrate with the group as part of the main training session. And I just thought what a great step that was in terms of easing the child into the system and ensuring that they were comfortable, bringing them together with a group of players who are also on trial, so they've got something in common, and then they go out and integrate with the groups. So I thought that was a fantastic way of managing trial players. But the recruitment and the release part of the business is brutal and it's hard. And I also remember being in positions where I absolutely didn't want to release the player, but the club's made the decision. You know, the head of recruitment might have made the decision, and unfortunately we had to deliver the message. So the clubs will generally do all they can to then support the player. I like to sort of use the term parachute. You know, they've got to have a parachute as they're moving out, and ensure that they've got some opportunities. So, for example, I remember we released a couple of players at Fulham who ended up next door at AFC Wimbledon, who were literally around the corner. Their training ground was only down the road. So obviously a club at the time that was further down the status system, but they still end up in an environment. And to be fair, 2 or 3 of those boys have actually kicked on out of their program. I know one's up at Glasgow Rangers now, played in the England youth team. So release doesn't necessarily mean the end of the line. Release can actually be the catalyst for a player to go on. And there's a lot of evidence around that. You read papers like Talent Needs Trauma, Dave Collins' work, and you sort of think, you know, there's a lot of evidence around the system and adversity and the importance of that in a player's journey. So release can often be a catalyst. Sometimes players, you know, that might be the end of the time for them in the professional system, but it can also help. Harry Kane's probably the most famous one, right? Going from Arsenal to Spurs, and the rest is history.
Oh, there's so many. Look at Jamie Vardy, who
Yeah.
longer time to make it than the others. His trauma is a great article, and it's something I thought about when I was at my time in New Zealand football. A lot of the girls there are high performers in their own environments and never really experienced loss or heartbreak or challenge. So I was like, how do we microdose little challenge points safely along their journey? Yeah. Deliberately kind of dropping them in the pit and let them kind of flounder for a little bit before you give them the tools so that they can come out of that pit, rather than just, it's always about winning. When you go in the world stage and you play Mexico, who are fighting to get out of Mexico, and that's their livelihood. You go, a little blonde ponytail from the North Shore of Auckland's never experienced trauma before, then that's not doing them a service as well. So well, fast forward, you're back in New Zealand now. You spent 3 years working for High Performance Sport New Zealand in an HPAD role. And this HPAD language, High Performance Athlete Development, we've had Ken Lynch on the show before. It's a language I've used quite often. So it's about systems, it's about pathways, it's across different sports. You had the opportunity to kind of bring some of your learnings and knowledge and beliefs that would have adapted from work in the UK for 6 or 7 years back to New Zealand. How much impact were you able to influence the system here, or was the system and it was your job to deliver the good practices out to those codes? How much kind of give and take were you able to have?
Yeah, look, there were a few reasons I took that role. I did have the opportunity to stay in Melbourne, and we were just having our first child, and I moved back to New Zealand at the time. In hindsight, it was great with the whole pandemic, etc. But one of the reasons I took that role was Ken. You know, I'd met Ken previously, and a mutual colleague of ours, Tony Reddings, had spoken so highly of Ken, and I'd been to an HPAD conference where he'd been very hospitable. So when the offer came to work with him, I thought, well, I'm going to learn from somebody who I believe is one of the best operators in the country. I also saw massive value in stepping away from football and looking at different sports, at athlete development across different codes, particularly around sports that I didn't know. Like, I ended up doing some work with equestrian. I still got really no idea about equestrian, but understanding the nature of how they're looking at their sport, worked with hockey, with netball, Paralympics, with swimming. So, got into that role, and it probably took a good 6 to 12 months to really sort of bed in and understand the system and some of the complexity of working within a government agency, which High Performance Sport New Zealand is. And then I guess over time you get more comfortable, where the role was really about being the critical friend. So we had a a great system that both Ken and Tony had established around biannual check-ins with different sports around their HPAD space, and the processes and system that Tony and Ken had designed that I was then able to go and implement with sports around what it could be anything from their future planning around leadership, their staff capability, their talent ID processes, and going through those conversations was actually it was, I guess, some heavy work, but really fruitful in terms of understanding where those sports were. And as part of the role, then you start having to sort of nudge and guide some of the HPAD leaders towards what you believe or what we would believe would be good practice in those sports to future-proof and ensure that essentially they have a more or as successful as possible transition of athletes from that HPAD stage, as it was called then in the system, through to high-performance environments. And across different sports, that process can be very different. The training age or the readiness point for sports can be very different. A footballer, for example, you could argue might need to be ready at 18, 19, 20 to go and make a senior debut, whereas in rowing, it might be much later, around 25, 26, 27, in terms of the performance age. So, like a massive amount of learning. In terms of influence, I guess it was one of those where, again, you're just trying to have those constant connections and conversations with people who are leading in their sports. But it wasn't a role where you can go in and tell people how to do things or how to run their sport, because, again, they've got the domain knowledge. You had to really try and be a support and look at how the organisation could provide support for their sports, whether that was through individual athlete funding, whether that was through programming, whether that was us being in situ and supporting. So there was a lot of variety in it. It was an interesting time, and I certainly learned a lot and benefited from working with the likes of Ken and also Dara Sheridan, who's now heading up high performance coaching at Irish Rugby. I mean, Dara's a great operator.
Yeah, absolutely. And no doubt, your current roles, director of coaching at Birkenhead on the big clubs in Auckland, and also taking the Westlake boys first 11. So I'm keen to find out, you've spent your time in Australia, UK, long time back to Australia in the academy systems. Now with HPAD knowledge and wisdom and systems and structures, I'm assuming you now got blank page, right? Both those environments. And you get to bring all this knowledge and wisdom and beliefs and experience and failures and mistakes to now, okay, how can we make the best environments possible for these, especially the coaches at Birko and now young boys coming through at Westlake. And the success, not that it's about the success on the pitch, but certainly Birkenhead, national champs, a whole lot of other various awards which you can talk about and experiences. But I guess, what did you bring in? What were the first starting points, the key pillars that were foundational? And then maybe is anything that you've sort of learnt, even testing them out in the New Zealand context, that maybe has to be refined a little bit further moving into next season?
Yeah, I could certainly waffle on for a while about the state of the system and the challenges in the system here, so I'll try and be as succinct as possible. Look, in terms of applying learnings, I think the first thing was I've always been very open around it's great to talk about the UK system. It was a privilege to be in that position and to work with some really top players. But now the system is so different. You can't contrast the New Zealand amateur club football landscape with the UK Premier League system. What you can do is take some really cool learnings from those and then adapt. So at the point I arrived at Birkenhead United, the club was going through or trying to seek TDP accreditation. So that is the talent development program, the New Zealand football criteria to be a talent development program to offer that. And so part of that was finding some quick wins, getting a quick connection with the coaches and making sure that, the key part of my job is program design and supporting coach development. So they're the two big rocks. So the first thing is, can we bring in some structure? I was lucky that Dan Cook, who's now working with FIFA and he's been part of the FIFA talent coach program, he's now got a different role with them, was in with the club for about 3 or 4 months prior to me coming in as he transitioned out of New Zealand. So he'd already put a few, I guess, structures in place. So my role was to kind of build on that. And the first thing I wanted to do was just observe. So I spent a good deal of time just observing, where are we with coach capability? What are the types of sessions being delivered? And then try and bring in some structure. So for example, the minimum criteria to be a coach in these programs is a New Zealand Football C license, which is the first step on the advanced coaching pathway as such. But for me, it's almost like getting your driver's license. It's designed to give you some formulas and some structure to your session. And you're learning at this point how to cook, for example, to reference Sean Douglas's analogy of the master chef as the master coach who can take the ingredients and cook. That takes years to master. So I think a C license coach for me is somebody who's obviously got a level of enthusiasm, a level of football knowledge, is on the pathway. So you've got to meet the coaches where they are. So one of the first things I said to them is, what is the number one most important thing you need from me? And almost unanimously, they said session plans. We just want that. So can we deliver a coherent session plan 2 to 3 times a week over the course of a season? And they wanted that plan. Now, even now, I still find it really hard. If you give me your session plan, it's highly unlikely I'm going to be able to go deliver your session the way you'd like it delivered. So those things are still in place as a backup, but over time, we are entering effectively year 3 of TDP next year. And my goal over time is to continue to support those coaches, but continue to give them more autonomy to start messing around with those ingredients. So the coaches have always got license within whatever the weekly theme is to say, hey, I'll just take part 2 and part 4 of the session plan, and then I'm going to plan part 1 and part 3, for example. They've always got license to do that. And I'm even wrestling with themes. Like we have a weekly theme. I spent some time with Sydney FC in March with a study visit for the Fijian FA and some of the work I do with OFC. And I love some of the way their program works around just principle based. And that really inspired me to just reconsider what we do. And it's not to copy and paste, because we can't just go from being Birko to Sydney FC, for example. But for me, one of the better programs I've seen run. And I thought it was really inspiring to see how you just include principles into your session design and then give the coaches the freedom to work within a selection or menu of activities. So that was a big one, bedding in structure around session design. And then over time, supporting with coach development. So again, I'm on the grass every week with the coaches. I'll go in and individually observe every coach in the program over the course of the year and provide feedback. And in speaking to people at NZF and Northern Football, there's very few clubs that are sort of investing in that space to go, hey, we've got somebody dedicated to go in and directly feedback. Those conversations can often be difficult. I'll often do it in different ways for different coaches. So it might be written feedback with a view to let's catch up over coffee and discuss it. It might be let's sit down in the dugout post session and have a 20, 30-minute chat around, what you did, what you're happy with, what I saw. But the aim is always to improve capability, and the coaches know I've got their best interests at heart. So I really enjoy that work because you're developing people, and I can think of several coaches in the program who have made some really good gains over the last 2 to 3 years around that. So yeah, step 1, observe. Step 2, bed in some structure. Step 3 is to start taking the shackles off a little bit. And we have tested things over the last 2 or 3 years, and we haven't got everything right. We've tested strength and conditioning nights. We've tested different nights of the week. We've tested mixed age nights, carousel nights. We've gone to futsal this year, which has been really good for some of the younger ones, but the older ones haven't engaged as much because perhaps they're quite fatigued because of the school club football landscape in New Zealand. So yeah, we're testing things every year. It's never going to be perfect, but I guess in an amateur context, I feel like we're moving forward, and organisationally we continue to get better year on year.
Yeah, I love that. So much for me to dig into, but I'm just conscious of time. What about the Westlake boys? So you've had that for a couple of seasons and have achieved success, but I guess what for 2025 for you? What's evolving? What needs to evolve or adapt based on year 3 of a project for you?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, in a Birko sense, year 3, we've got to continue to get better. We've got to continue to show that we're improving, and I've got some thoughts around how we can be a little bit more demanding, both from a coaching and playing perspective. With the Westlake program and I guess that project, it came out of nowhere a little bit, and the opportunity came up, and was very timely because I was doing my pro license at the time, and it was great to get my hands on a group of players to, I guess, run the senior program across the first team and reserves, where we have a wider training squad of sometimes up to 40 players across 2 squads. So yeah, and I guess it's interesting because whilst these are players who I guess mainly are 15 to 18 years old, the bulk of the squad being on the older side, for many it's the pinnacle of their football experience in their teenage years. Some of them opt out and don't actually go on to play football beyond school. Some of them, it might be the top level of football they ever get to, because they might, just go and play club football at a Div 1 men's team, or further down the leagues. So I think the important thing for me was, how do we create a really unbelievable experience? And within the school sporting system, this particular team is the pinnacle, and it is the time to perform. So I guess the first year I was really wrestling with that whole development versus performance thing, and I probably became more comfortable in the second season around, okay, we're really demanding performance. But it's still youth sport, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that you still got children in your care, and it's critical that coaches behave themselves and hold themselves in the right account. And the interesting thing around the first year, where we won everything, which was amazing, it was never really the goal. The goal was always to start looking at what are the processes and what does the culture look like within the group, and how do we establish a culture which is owned by the players but demanding, where there's accountability and there's responsibility on them and on me and expectation. But we were never sitting there going, hey, we're just going to win the league. Like, every team says they want to win the league, or they want to win the nationals, or they want to win the cup. That's fine. Every team's got that same goal. But my big focus early doors was to get those processes and that culture right, and get the players to own the language around their culture. And momentum built really nicely, and we had a great 23, and more or less backed it up in 2024. I mean, nationals was a little disappointing, but in semi-finals and knockout football with tired bodies, you can concede a goal late and lose a semi, and that's football. But we still won 3 trophies this year, and created some unbelievable stories and memories, and also got to go and attend the Schools World Cup in China, which was incredible, absolutely incredible this season. So yeah, it's been a really enjoyable couple of years, and I think there's a huge amount of potential coming through to build on for next season.
And just before we finish, I want to bring in PDP, so Player Development Project, co-founder. You got your shirt there with the logo on at the bottom of the screen for those watching on YouTube. Tell us a little bit about what PDP is. Why PDP, and what value you believe it's bringing to the landscape of coaches and players and parents?
Yeah, so PDP has actually been around 10 years this year. Started as an app, evolved to an iPad magazine when that was all the rage in about 2013, 14, and quickly they faded away. And in about 2015, it became an online platform for coaches. So yeah, we've been creating content now for, almost 10 years. And, it's been an amazing journey in terms of trying to crack a very small niche in terms of the business itself. And the platform is a subscription model. Over time, beyond developing content and, live sessions and session plans and all the interviews and work we've done over the years with experts around the world, we've also created online courses for coaches. So we've been lucky to have the likes of Rob Sherman, Dan Cook, who I mentioned earlier, Tony Reddings, Craig Harrison, all contributing to courses that we've developed around different areas, so introduction to coaching or physical performance in football, as well as like your sort of foundations of session design or fundamentals of session design course. So yeah, we've built a massive library of resource. We're pretty confident it's the biggest library of coaching resource in the world. There's thousands and thousands of pieces of content, free and paid, on the website. Obviously, we've got the courses, and then beyond that, we've got a community. I have regular contact with PDP members every single week. For years, we also podcasted and had some great experiences building the pod. And we've just had to pivot and adapt over time as to what we offer. And most recently, we've developed Coach Frank, which is our new AI-driven session planning app. And Frank's a pretty cool bit of kit. We've had some great feedback from early users, and we're excited to see where it can go. So yeah, it's a suite of resources for coaches and a community around it where they can have direct contact with us. So it's been pretty cool to connect with a lot of coaches around the world over time and develop content for coaches as well.
Yeah, fantastic resource. I'm a member myself. Go on, give us the website.
It's playerdevelopmentproject.com, so you can find out all of about all of the resources, courses, etc., all on that site.
Hey, mate, I really appreciate your time. We can talk for hours on lots of stuff. There were some questions I had here, which we maybe have to get you back for and speak in some more detail and depth around some of the Westlake experiences in particular. But let's close this off with rapid fire questions.
Sure.
Pose a question for me and the audience to consider for the week.
Yeah, this is a great question. I'd say, when you intervene, are you adding value or adding complexity? So my thinking there is, Don't open your mouth to sort of justify your existence. Be self-aware around anything from verbal instruction or intervention through to body language and the impact it might make.
That's fine. Give us a concept or an idea that you've been thinking about recently that maybe we can apply.
Yeah, the concept's called RATA. So it stands for Raising Awareness and Transferring Accountability. Picked that up on the OFC Pro license course. And for me, essential to effective leadership and developing accountability, initiative, responsibility, and people.
Is that by somebody? Is it someone you can reference?
Yeah, so Craig Philpott, who actually works with High Performance Sport New Zealand and is a former very successful domestic rugby coach here in New Zealand and coached the under-20 New Zealand rugby team, was leading parts of the course. And yeah, he came up with this idea and shared this idea of RATA. And I think I look at it a lot through the lens of developing coaches that I work with every week and trying to, raise their awareness and transfer accountability into how they operate. I think it's a nice one to take away.
Recommendation of a book, movie, or a podcast?
Yeah, I've got a couple. So I think books-wise, if you're really into football and want to understand some of the stuff around the academy system, there was a book that came out around 2015, I think, called No Hunger in Paradise by Michael Calvin. A couple others, Seven Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey, I think is a great one for life. And The Art of Thinking Clearly by Rolf DeBelly. Had some impact a few years ago.
Nice one. If you had a magic wand, if I gave you a wand and you could wave it and change one thing, I'll leave this open. You can go where you want with this. What would you change?
Well, if I think about the sports system, I'll just stay on theme. I would shift the dial on the role of tradition in football. So I've again alluded to some of that in the chat today, whether that's around traditional trial processes or in the New Zealand context, the challenges we have around school or club football. I think the system needs to be better designed to suit the need of the participant. And I think that takes bravery at a leadership and administrative level. So I know there's a lot of countries with a lot of challenges in their youth development system, but essentially make things more player-centered to develop more and better players.
Nice. One piece of advice that you were once given that you can pass on to us.
On time is late. So our academy director at Brentford was exceptionally demanding, and we had a mantra in the club: on time is late. And I've stuck with that. I've always been a punctual person. I think the concept ties into my own values of respect and integrity, and making sure you do what you say you will and you respect other people's time. And it's been a great one to sort of set standards, particularly in that Westlake culture over the last couple of years, where the boys have bought into it, and even the captain referenced it in his own personal bio this year, which was pretty nice.
Yeah, nice. I'm not sure who said it, but if you're not early, you're late. Sort of a
Yeah.
concept as well. What is the thing that you are striving for today?
Balance is a big one. So I've got two little boys who are 3 and 5, and I've got 3 contracts in an online business. And so I have a lot of juggling in my life. So the big focus of that balance is trying to invest enough time in my own personal fitness and well-being, I guess, as well as balance life and work around family, because I want to spend as much time with my wee men as I can while they're still very little. So it's a big one, I think, in coaching.
It's not the first or second, probably not even the third time somebody has given us a balance question or response. So again, as a high performer yourself, we're hearing this a lot, right? So again, it's something to be considerate of on our journey up as an athlete, as a coach, as a parent as well. How do we make sure there's balance within all of our lives? That we don't get burned out, we don't get fatigued, we don't drop the ball in another area, because the modern life is kind of spinning these plates. And I've just been thinking about the idea of deletion of things actually a performance enhance as much as adding new stuff. What can I take away to actually thrive in certain areas? So yeah, that balance piece is huge. Lastly, leave us with a quote for the week.
Actually heard this on a podcast about, it must have been within the last month. Don't set goals, set standards. And I think it's not to not set goals, because direction setting absolutely matters, but as does having an objective. But if we set our standards and expectations, and we set a good culture, these will ultimately be the defining factors in performance or results.
Dave Wright, it's been a great chat. Lots to dig into there, further conversation and further thinking required in a lot of these areas, but hopefully some real practical tools where coaches, program leads can go away and kind of apply or test and experiment. Because again, as you sort of said there with the Birko thing, there's no right or wrong way for an environment. It's lots of different experiences, and keep get moving the needle forward based on that. But also athletes, a little bit of an understanding of what it is like to be an athlete, performance athlete in the UK, and there's some learnings there for parents to sort of tie those threads together. So I really appreciate the chat. I take so much from these conversations because I get asked the questions I want to learn from and understand. So, you've made my morning. So appreciate it. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Gareth. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much for sticking through to the end of this episode. It would mean the world to us if you could hit the like or share button so we can get these amazing insights out to other like-minded coaches, athletes, and parents. Cheers.